2017 sitting. Apologies for last week when we were due to have a class on Tuesday night. I was at a funeral during the day. Thought I'd be able to make it easily in time for the evening, but it became apparent fairly quickly that was not going to work. So apologies for the late cancellation. This would have been class number 7. It is instead class number 6. Class number 7 is next Tuesday night, and I've rescheduled class number 8 to the only available spot I could find, I'm afraid, which is a Friday night. Hey ho, not to worry. And apologies also for the slightly late start to tonight's class. The reason for that is fairly straightforward and is linked to the first thing we will be looking at this evening. Let me therefore give you a reminder of where we have got to and therefore where we will be picking it up from. And then I can explain what I'm talking about with this link as to why I was a few minutes late. So we are in chapter number 7 of the class notes, and that means we are looking at corporate social responsibility. 2 weeks ago, we looked at what a stakeholder is. Remember, someone who can impact a company or be impacted by what a company does. And so far, we've seen that if stakeholders can impact us as a company, we need to know about that for very practical profit reasons, because if stakeholders can do things to us, they could potentially get in the way of us achieving our corporate strategies, or in other words, making loads of money. On the other hand, if what we do as a company has an impact on stakeholders, we need to be aware of that for maybe 2 possible reasons. Number 1, as the caring, ethical people that we are, if we're impacting other people, we should care about that. That's the moral argument. But if we turn that around to a profit argument, we could also argue that if we are having an impact on people and that impact is negative, that might not look so good, and the reputation damage could impact our profits. So we can disappear from the morals and the ethics again and turn it all into making loads of money. So we've looked at who stakeholders are. We've looked at how to prioritise, because if we look at traditional governance and say that companies should just make money for shareholders, then you've only got shareholders to worry about. Okay, some shareholders want profit now. Some will wait for the longer term. So you've got a bit of a conflict there, but it's just shareholders. The moment we open this up to other stakeholders, the problem is, well, who comes top of the pile? Because customers, suppliers, employees, the environment may all have different claims against the company, different needs, different wants. And what we do as a company probably means some will win and some will lose. So how do we balance things up? Whose priorities are the most important? No right answer to that, but as we've seen, there are many different ways that we might try to rank our stakeholders. One of which was Mendeley, which we looked at towards the end of that previous session. We then looked at how to actually address our stakeholders. Do we wait for them to come to us? If they do come to us, do we bat them away? Or do we try and come to a mutually agreeable solution with them? Or do we not even wait for them to come to us? Maybe we go to them. Interesting stuff. Now, the place where we left it in the class notes is page number 91. So I'll disappear off down to a corner. And CSR strategy and strategic CSR. And as you can see there, I think I got as far as explaining that there is an Examiner article on this, but that's as far as I got. The article is a relatively recent one. Not that that's that helpful, because we've had no P1 articles for a very long time. I think this one, if memory is right, was about 2 years ago. It has been tested, but it might come up again. And it looks a little confusing, doesn't it? CSR strategy, strategic CSR. Is this just silly words? Well, let's have a look at it. So, question. Why was I a little bit late? Well, in our building at the moment, I'm up on floor 7. My office is down a lot lower. We have got 2 lifts, but for the past 3 and a bit months, one of those lifts has been broken and the whole thing is having to be replaced. So we only have 1 lift for the entire building. Not to worry, because in a crisis, you can take the stairs, right? Yeah. I have a slight problem with stairs at the moment. You see, on Sunday, I got myself this baby here. That is a medal for finishing the London Marathon, which I rather crazily decided to do at the weekend. So 48 hours ago, I was lying in a heap on the floor, having finished this thing. The result is my legs currently feel like 2 concrete blocks. I can sort of waddle around on a flat floor a bit, and I'm fine standing up. It's actually nicer standing than sitting, to be frank. But anything involving steps, that hurts. That hurts a lot. So I had to wait for the lift, hence a little bit late. But why is any of this relevant to what we're doing here? Well, I ran the marathon because I have run it a couple of times before, a long time ago. I ran it because I wanted to, personal achievement. But if I'm going to run the marathon, I might as well try and raise a bit of money while I do it. So I ran the marathon in aid of the London Community Fund, which is raising money for people in London who are less fortunate, sleeping on the streets, and that sort of thing. Seems like a nice idea. Now, I'm not telling you all of this as a means of saying, here's my website, please will you sponsor me. If you want to sponsor me, please feel free. But that's not the reason I'm telling you. The reason I'm telling you is to help explain CSR strategy and strategic CSR. Now, I find with these 2 rather odd-sounding things, it's easiest if I start with explaining strategic CSR, and then I'll do CSR strategy, if you don't mind. So, what do we mean by I can't even say it. Strategic CSR. Well, we know what CSR is, corporate social responsibility, right? And we've looked at different levels to which you can take this. Now, I work for LSBF. I did not do this in LSBF's name. I did this in my own personal name. But let's assume, okay, that there's a bit of a company thing behind me doing this. Well, why did I do this? To make more money for the company? Well, no, there's no link there. Legal? Am I forced to run a marathon? I think not. Ethical? Does society expect people to run marathons for charity? No, I don't think it does. So it seems that I've gone the extra mile, well, the extra 26 miles and 385 yards, and I can feel every one of them in my legs. I seem to have gone the extra mile and been a rather nice chap to raise money for charity when I really didn't need to. So it would seem to me that when Paul ran the marathon for charity, I had done a bit of philanthropy. Society did not legally require it of me, or in fact expect it of me, but I did it anyway. And that, of course, is one of the nice things about doing it, because the crowds really cheer you on, because they look at you and think, I'm glad you're doing this and not me, mate, and well done on you for doing it. And they can see the t-shirt says you're doing it for charity, and they cheer you on. Question is, though, why might I have done this? And one potential reason is that I did it to position myself as the tutor who cares. Maybe that's it. Maybe this is the new LSBF marketing campaign. Come to LSBF because our tutors run marathons for charity. We care. Would that work? Might students choose LSBF over other providers because they think their tutors are nice people who care? I suppose I should ask you, really, shouldn't I? I'm not sure it's at the top of your issues list when you're choosing providers, is it? Does my tutor raise money for charity? I doubt it. But do you know what? And I'm not making this up. A certain Big Four firm chose the provider for their accountancy exam training a few years ago, and I know this because I was involved in it, chose their provider because one of them raised money for charity and the other didn't. And they said, after they'd made the choice, it was a 50-50 choice, but because they, as a Big Four firm, wanted to be corporate socially responsible, they wanted to choose a supplier of services who was as well. So some organisations will do CSR as a strategic thing. They are doing it to position themselves to try to win business. And it's not just about winning customers. Now, this is perhaps a slightly dangerous sweeping statement, but maybe it's the case that the average person who raises money for charity is an ethical, law-abiding, unproblematic employee to have who's got the right sort of attitude at work. Maybe those are the sort of people you'd want to offer jobs to. So it can win you sales. It might attract good quality people to come and work here. It might also keep the government regulators off your back. Because of the positive image you are creating. So strategic CSR is a sort of strategic positioning thing. It's about the choice to do CSR and why you are doing it. It's about placing your company in a particular zone, maybe to differentiate yourself against other companies in the industry. So that's strategic CSR. So what's CSR strategy then? Why do companies do corporate social responsibility? It might be a strategy, it might not. It might just be something you're doing naturally because you're the sort of ethical person who just does CSR anyway. Don't have to be asked. The point is, you're doing it. So one of your employees comes along and says, hello, I'd like to run the London Marathon and I'm going to do it for charity. And boss, will the company sponsor me? Well, there's a potential danger at this point. Because if LSBF Interactive says, yes, Paul, we'll sponsor you. I mean, that's nice. That makes me a happy boy. I raise a bit more money. Yay. But my charity is helping the City of London. And that's nice. But if you say yes to every member of staff who's trying to raise some money for charity, is there not a risk that you end up throwing your CSR niceness at so many different causes you don't actually help anybody a material amount? I mean, wouldn't you expect companies to have chosen charities that they're trying to do good for? And isn't there also a risk that I ask 3 different managers in the company, will the company sponsor me? And all 3 of them say yes, and I get 3 lots of sponsorship. Or worse, one says yes and one says no. Chaos. If you are going to do some CSR for whatever reason, it needs to have some organisation behind it. Otherwise, anything you do is going to end up being rather random. Some customers will get good customer service, some won't. Some employees will be looked after, some will not. So CSR strategy is saying if you're going to do anything inside a company, CSR or anything else to be frank, you need to organise it. Otherwise it's a bit of a mess. So that's what it is all about. CSR strategy and strategic CSR. A little bit odd. It's one of those things I think you'd need to learn before exam day, because if it comes up, it will twist your brain totally. There is an article on the subject on the ACCA's website in the P1 section, and basically the class notes are sort of a summary of that article. Okay, let's move on then. We are thankfully nearing the end of chapter number 7. And the last thing we're going to look at in this chapter is a phrase that you might have heard of: corporate citizenship. So what's this all about then? We are all human beings and we live wherever we live in a society. And when we live in society, we have a habit of demanding certain rights. Things like the right to own things, the right to earn a living, we don't expect people to be beating us up and stealing things. We expect some protection from the law and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that society can help provide. If you go and live in the middle of the forest and there is no society, you have no rights. You fend for yourself. Come and live in society and you get some protection. But if you're going to have rights, as a citizen, we should bear in mind we have some responsibilities. What are our responsibilities as citizens? Well, if we want the protection of laws, we've also got to make sure we follow them in respect of anybody else. You can't take and not give, can you? It needs to go in both directions. We should respect all the rights of others. And we may go further and say that our job is to follow whatever society says is right and wrong, whether it's in the law or not. Now, to a great extent, we've heard something similar to this, haven't we? This is corporate social responsibility, isn't it? Archie Carroll. Same sort of thing. We might even go a bit further from a sort of philanthropy position on this and say it is the responsibility of everyone who lives in society not just to comply, which is what everything up there is saying at the moment, but where possible, to try to make the world a better place. Try to make society better, because if no member of society tries to make society better, society not only won't get any better, my bet is it will probably get worse. We should look to improve things. Now, not necessarily everybody can make the world a better place. One group of people we would hope would make the world a better place, I'm afraid, are people like us, professionals, because we have the skills, the understanding that we can make society better. We can do things in the public interest, not just avoid doing things that are against the public interest. So that's the concept of a citizen as a human being. Corporate citizenship argues that corporate social responsibility is in return for your rights as a corporate citizen. In other words, companies expect to be able to do things, and if they're going to have those things, they need to do CSR as well. Otherwise, it's not fair. Oops. That just about says corporate citizen. So a corporate citizen, a company, wants rights. What's the company's rights? To own property, just like a human. To make profits rather than earn a living, same idea, I suppose. And protection of the law. So companies would be upset if protesters got into their building, burned it to the ground, stole everything. They would say, look, that's not fair. You wouldn't break into someone's house and do that. You can't do it to us either as a company. But if companies want those rights, they must also accept that as a company, they have responsibilities, i.e. CSR. What are those responsibilities? Well, we've seen it already, haven't we? Follow the law. So, for example, pay your taxes. Now, there's an interesting one, isn't there? Because many big companies have been accused of shopping around different countries, placing their head offices in strategic locations to try to get the most favourable tax treatment and preferably pay no tax anywhere. Is that socially responsible? Not sure it is it? If you operate in a country, then you should pay the taxes in that country. Of course, the companies will say, we are just working within the law. We are not doing anything illegal. Of course, Archie Carroll would say, it's not just economic responsibility and legal, it's ethical. And I think most of society would say, if you make millions in country X, you should pay your taxes in country X, not employ clever people to make you pay taxes somewhere where tax is cheaper. Now, this is going to put us as accountants in a rather difficult position, isn't it? On the one hand, I'm saying as professionals, we need to make the world a better place. And on the other hand, when companies are shifting their tax liabilities around to countries where maybe they don't have to pay too much money, who are they employing to help them shift that tax around? That'll be us accountants. And there are quite a few people, as we'll discover late on in this course, who say accountants are the absolute opposite of corporate social responsibility, because we are helping people bend around the laws and act in what is probably an unethical manner because we have the skills to show them how to do that. That's a troubling argument. We'll see it later in the course. So, follow the law. And maybe, as we've seen, act ethically. Which is a difficult one. Because who knows how society will define what is ethical. You notice that this part of the course, compared with what we've done up till now, is very different, isn't it? Corporate governance is do this because of this, do this because of this. A lot of it's common sense, procedures, policies, processes, guidelines, rules for companies to be run the right way. The moment we open it up and say, what about other stakeholders, we get very philosophical, very thoughtful. We start getting lots of but oh, and lots of conflict. And that creates a lot of discussion. Far more interesting part of the course, harder to learn it. It's more an understanding area. So there we go. That is corporate citizenship. And it brings us on to the last bit of the chapter, the very last bit, which says, okay then, so we're saying companies have the right to own property. If you have the right to own property, what are the responsibilities? Well, to a great extent, it's what we've just said. If you own property, well, that's fine. Society will let you own things. But you are now responsible for the impact that property has on others. So, simple example, you own a pet dog. You go to the park to walk pet dog. You throw stick for pet dog to chase. Pet dog chase stick. Pet dog brings stick back. You throw stick again. Pet dog getting very excited at this point. After 3 or 4 turns of throwing stick, you throw stick. Pet dog hurtles after stick. Pet dog finds small child. Pet dog thinks stick boring now. Overexcited pet dog sinks teeth into small child and picks small child up and brings child back to you. Small child cries a lot. Small child, lots of blood. Parents not happy. Well, that's your dog. You're legally responsible for the fact that that dog was not looked after properly and has had an impact on that child. Let us now extend that concept. So companies have the right to own assets, probably not a dog anymore. Let's have a factory. Therefore, the company is responsible for the pollution that factory creates. Therefore, that company is responsible for the traffic problems the factory creates because of deliveries, staff arriving at work, staff leaving work. And then you've got all those people working there and they will want some social activities in the workplace, which means you have a responsibility for looking after your employees, not just 9 to 5, but if they want work events, work sports events, work parties, maybe you're responsible for that as well. But there is another angle we can take this down as well. Because we can extend that idea. and say, okay then. You own shares in Company A. In other words, you own Company A. Property. If that company is polluting, whose responsibility is that? Because usually when companies do naughty things, we go after the directors, don't we? Because they're the ones running it, they're the ones making the decisions. Well, this argument about owning property and we give you the right to own it, but you've got to accept the responsibilities, maybe that suggests we should blame the shareholders. But does this not cause a bit of a problem? If you own a dog and the dog bites someone, then that is your responsibility because you own the dog. But only you own the dog. One owner, 100%. In a company, if thousands of shareholders own a tiny percentage each, and on top of that, many of them are very short-term owners. Bear in mind, some people buy and sell shares within the same 10 minutes. They are effectively gambling. Can we really say it's the shareholders' fault? Maybe owning shares is not the same sort of ownership as owning a dog. And if you do own a dog, you care about a dog, don't you? You know what the dog is capable of, so you try and look after it and keep its dangerous teeth away from small children. When you own a company, well, if you own all of it, one would imagine you understand what the company does and the potential risks. If you own a tiny percentage of it, do you really understand it that much? I mean, would you do that much research for a £500 investment? And what if you don't own the shares directly? What if you've got money in a pension scheme and the pension scheme owns the shares? Because if the pension scheme owns the shares, you might not even realise you've got shares in that company. So we've got a tricky situation here in deciding how much responsibility shareholders have for the companies that they own. And maybe the conclusion that comes from this is that we can only hold shareholders liable for the activities of companies if the shareholding is both significant and is being held for a period of time. In which case, which type of shareholders are we likely to be saying we're going to hold responsible? Yep, it's them again. We seem to be coming to a conclusion that not all shareholders are the same. And maybe we need to turn to the pension funds, insurance companies, investment management companies, hedge funds, and say, look, you've got expertise, you're investing a lot of money, so you have done your research, you know what you're putting your money into, and you're going to be around for a while. So don't just put your money in and let the directors get on with it. You have a duty to control these crazy directors and try to make sure they're doing a good job ethically, legally, etc. Wow. Well, we seem to have reached the end of chapter number 7. And that means we can now head away from CSR and ethics and stuff for a while. We'll come back to it at the end of the course. And we can now go on and look at internal controls and risk. Now this is covered by chapters 8, 9, 10 and 11 of the notes. A lot of the internal control side of things that we're going to be starting with, you will have seen on the F8 course when you did audit. It's partly a different angle here, but some of the angle is the same as F8, so hopefully that will make you feel nice and comfortable. And then we'll move into risk. So what are we going to be looking at in these 4 chapters? Companies need to manage risk effectively. A fairly obvious statement. Why? Well, risk is related to return. So if you don't manage your risks, by definition, you're not managing your returns. Returns for shareholders. And if you don't manage risks, something catastrophic could happen and wipe out the entire company. So risk is a very important thing to be on top of. That then raises a lot of potential issues. Who should do the risk management in a company? How much risk should we be taking? Lots of risk, little bit of risk, average, I don't know. How do I find out what risks are out there? Now I know there are some risks. How do I measure them? Which ones are the priority? I've got to start by managing priority risk number 1, so what's the most important one? Let's get rid of that. Now I know what risks I've got and what the priority ones are. I need to think about some methods to manage those risks. One method to manage risks is a separate topic on the course. It's so big. And that's internal controls. Now that's not the end of it. There's more stuff as well. If I'm managing risk, how much of this do I tell to my shareholders, for example? So that is where chapters 8 through 11 are going to go. As I've said before, you'll get some element of familiarity in here from stuff you've seen on F8. Which is always nice, of course. So let us begin. We start on page 99 of the notes. Again, quite a chatty part, or quite a chatty start even, to the chapter, so let me give you a bit of focus on it. Every organisation that is bigger than really tiny one is bound to have some sort of control mechanisms going on. It's natural, it just happens. So, for example, when you cross a road, you don't really need to be told that you need to look left, look right, be careful, because otherwise you'll get hit by a truck. So a lot of control will just evolve normally. So what is the focus of corporate governance then? Is it to have a control system? Well, no, not really, because most companies probably will have one anyway. It is not the having of the control system, it's assessing if your controls are effective. And if they're not effective, fixing them. When you did internal controls on the F8 exam, you looked at internal controls over the selling process, the purchasing process, payroll process, etc. In other words, you're looking at areas that involve financial reporting and therefore the financial statements, which is understandable because that's the focus of the F8 exam. The focus on P1, on the other hand, well, we're not just auditing the accounts, this is about governing the corporation, the whole business. So the focus on controls here is rather broader. Page 100 of the notes. What's going on there? Well, I've already mentioned the importance of it's not just financial reporting controls, it's broader. But the other point made on that page, that's this page here, by the way, is how do you know if your controls are effective? Get someone to check. Who is going to check? Well, the external auditors will be assessing your controls while they check the accounts. But is that enough? Well, maybe, maybe not. So who checks internal control effectiveness? The external auditors. But they're only checking the financial statements are true and fair, so they are going to focus on controls that have an accounting impact. No accounting impact, external auditors probably don't care. And the other problem with the external auditors is they're not here all year. They're only going to be around maybe once or twice a year, so their checks are not very regular. And if we've got problems, we don't want to wait till the end of the year to find out. So the focus on this course is rather more towards the internal auditors. Rather more helpfully. Right, so we now see that internal control is potentially important. We see what we want it to do. As with all things that you seem to learn as part of your exams, before we get into any detail, we need to have an overview of what we're aiming for. What makes a strong control system? What are we aiming for in principle? Something that works. Now at this point there is a little bit of difference here between what you've seen on F8 and what you see on P1. Because on F8 we're purely looking at it from a financial reporting perspective, the focus is narrower. You may well remember from F8 that a good internal control system has 5 elements. But when you look in the class notes at pages 101 to 102, there are only 4. What is going on here, I hear you scream. Let's explain. I wonder how much you remember from F8. 5 elements of a decent control system. Number 1 is the control environment. Number 2, the control procedures or activities. Activities is the American word, procedures. Good answer. No, I can't remember anything. Procedures, the more UK word. Information systems. Risk assessment. And monitoring. So those are the traditional 5. Let me just remind you what all of that means, and then we'll look at which one is missing from pages 101 and 102 and try to understand why. Control environment, as the class notes will tell you. There you go. Often referred to as the culture or the tone at the top. Now, because it's 2 weeks ago, I can't actually remember which news stories I've mentioned and which I haven't. I've got a feeling I did mention the Barclays one, Barclays Bank and the whistleblower. And Barclays are getting a certain amount of good reputation as to how they've handled this. So quick reminder in case I haven't told you. Whistleblower raised an issue at Barclays Bank. The issue seems to indirectly affect the chief executive's behaviour. Chief Executive has tried to find out who the anonymous whistleblower is, which is against whistleblower policy, because the whole point of having a policy is to encourage people to anonymously report things. If they think the directors are going to investigate and try and find out who they are, they won't want to say anything. But the good news is the other Barclays directors have told the Chief Executive off and said you cannot do that, and have stopped him doing it. And are going to fine him, I think, $1 million of bonus. Ooh, nasty slap on wrist. And they're reporting into the regulators, who may well fine him or discipline him in some way as well. That is a good tone at the top. What message does that say to anyone else at Barclays? It sends the message that yes, please feel free to report things. No one is going to try and work out who you are. You will be safe. And that helps to support the rest of the system. Sends a very strong message down through the organisation. If you want a strong control environment though, it's helpful if it's not just the management at the top. It's also helpful if you've got the sort of staff who respect control, follow rules without arguing too much, look to improve those rules by making suggestions. In other words, they're supportive. And that means good quality human resources in terms of recruitment and training of staff can help as well. So control environment, very, very, very important. Control procedures are the detailed things companies tend to do. So things like the bank reconciliations, security controls, locking doors, have a safe, alarms, things like that. Passwords on computers, all that sort of stuff. Information systems, very important, because if you have no information, it would be rather hard to know if your control system is working. Risk assessment, because if you don't understand the risks you are facing, you would surely control the wrong things. And monitoring, if controls are not watched, then either your staff stop doing them, or the controls get outdated. A good example actually of one of those in UK recently, in fact a couple of days ago, new speeding fines have come in, hooray. And it's been pointed out that the actual amount you got fined for speeding had not changed for years, and it got to the point that it's actually fairly affordable. So speeding fines are going up because there is a concern that fines are so cheap, people aren't that bothered if they get caught. They'll be a lot more bothered now, trust me. So why do the class notes only have 4 at this point? Well, the reason they only have 4 is this one here. Risk assessment is not a single thing, it is a process. Because in order to assess risks, you first got to identify them, work out how much risk you want to face, come up with some measurement system and come up with some solutions. It's actually a multi-element process in itself. Now you may have heard this on F8, or you might not, it's not that important for F8, but the whole internal control stuff on this course and risk management all comes from an organisation called COSO. That stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations. Basically, who are these sponsoring organisations? They are the accountancy institutes in America. Because many years ago, and I'm talking many, at least 30 years ago, they all got together, cracked their heads together to come up with some ideas as to what internal control systems should look like, and they came up with a plan. Since then, they have developed those plans. They've not sat around doing nothing, and they've expanded them. And COSO have now come up with something called Enterprise Risk Management, or ERM for short. And ERM we will meet in chapter 11, I think it is, of the class notes. That's coming up later. So they've actually basically taken the internal control stuff and said, hang on a minute, internal controls Risk assessment is one part of it, but risk assessment is a whole process in itself. So they've taken the risk assessment bit out of the internal control structure and turned it into something huge on its own. So how many elements are there to a control system? You can either say 4 or 5. I'd go for 5 for safety if I were you. In the UK, we still call it 5. In America, they've said 4, purely because one bit of it, the 5th one, they've now turned into something bigger in its own regard. So there we go. And that, I'm pretty sure, is in chapter 11, so we will see that either next time or during... we'll see that next time, next week. Wonderful. Now, that takes us halfway through tonight's class. So what I'm going to do there, I'm still rehydrating after running the marathon thing, is I'm going to go and get a 5-minute break and a few glasses of water. We'll be back in about 5 minutes to pick it up again on page 105 with some more internal control stuff. I will see you then, and do not be perturbed to just create the break in the presentation this evening. I'm just going to turn the system off and then immediately back on again, just to illustrate where the break happens, okay? So that if you're watching this back, you can watch it as 2 1-hour classes rather than 1 2-hour class. I'll see you in about 5 minutes.